So, here we are on the other side of the first season of Star Trek Picard. And in all honesty, I'm still in awe that this show even exists. Star Trek Nemesis was 18 years ago, and while we have gotten some wonderful entries into the Trek franchise since then, fight me, we haven't seen anything past Nemesis in almost 2 decades. Outside of some brief snippets in Star Trek 2009, and the non-canon Star Trek Online, and the excellent novelverse, which you should totally read as it contains, in my opinion, the best Star Trek long-form storytelling ever done. But when Patrick Stewart surprised all of us with his announcement that he was returning to Star Trek with a series centered around his iconic character Picard, I was honestly an emotional wreck, as I'm sure many other Trekkies were.
Jean-Luc Picard is back.
And then you throw in the fact that Michael Chabon, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Cavalier and Clay, as well as what I think is still one of the most beautiful 15 minutes in all of Star Trek with the short trek Calypso, was showrunning, and throw in the fact that one of my favorite novelists, Kristen Beyer, was writing, as well as the fact that Trek veterans Jonathan Del Arco, Jonathan Frakes, Marina Sirtis, and one of my personal favorite Trek actors, Jerry Ryan, would be reprising their iconic characters as well, I was truly ready for my favorite franchise to boldly go forward. But how did the first season of Star Trek Picard ultimately go? Well, let's dive into both the positives and the negatives, of which there are plenty of both.
I don't want the game to end. They're victims, not monsters. A butterfly that lives forever is really not a butterfly at all.
Let's start with the positives. First and foremost, Picard was a true storytelling risk for Star Trek. This is the first Trek series that doesn't focus on a Starfleet crew. Instead, it's all centered around one civilian character, Picard, a man who, while still recognizable as the Picard we loved on The Next Generation, feels like an echo of that man that we knew. Now defined by the death of his friend Data, as well as his failure to save many of the Romulan citizens after the destruction of Romulus, with the writers smartly using the dangling plot threads from Nemesis and Star Trek 2009 to inform Picard's off-screen development all these years later. Yet it would have seemed untrue and on the nose if we re-entered Picard's life as a depressed, drunken shut-in. No, instead, the dignified and noble Picard is still productive, writing novels of history and running a vineyard. Yet we still feel that he's lost a piece of himself.
The dreams are lovely. It's the waking up that I'm beginning to resent.
The audience, whether you're a born and bred Trekkie or only aware of Picard through cultural osmosis, inherently know that this isn't the place for Picard, a man who always yearned to be in the stars, not on Earth. This is not the place you would expect Picard to be in as a character when we pick up with him 2 decades later. Yet it also feels entirely natural for him as well. All this is brilliantly portrayed by Patrick Stewart, showing us Picard's poise and dignity, yet still feeling broken by the direction of his life. So when he gets his call to action in the form of Issa Briones' Dahj, it's just the pull he needs back into the world he was made for. And this is a wonderfully creative and perfectly Trek story for him to get involved in. Making Dahj into Data's daughter allows Picard and us a personal connection with the story. Yet by mixing in the greater political conflict of the synthetic ban and a cultural prejudice against synthetics after a terrorist attack on Mars, allowed the show to do what Star Trek does best. Use science fiction allegory and metaphor to indirectly, and yet still directly, comment on today's politics of discrimination against marginalized groups. And mixing that synthetic ban into what Picard sees as his own failure to save Romulan citizens during a refugee crisis creates a brilliant cocktail of personal and grandiose stakes for our intrepid former captain. And these stakes allow for a great deconstruction of Picard's character. Certainly, the decision to step down from Starfleet in righteous anger and indignation felt true to Picard, yet also wholly worth dissecting as incorrect. Picard, someone who has always stood for higher ideals, walked away from a situation in order to keep his hands clean, and just gave up. It was a no-win scenario, so Picard simply chose not to play. Certainly, while banning and harboring prejudice against synths was wrong, for everything else, Starfleet was put in a situation where no choice was right, and yet it had to forge on regardless. Ultimately, and understandably but self-interestedly, giving up on saving Romulans. They couldn't keep their hands clean no matter what option they chose. So the show calls out Picard for his stepping away in both large and small scale ways. From his interactions with Starfleet,
sheer fucking
to his leaving behind Romulan citizens and a childhood figure shown through the character of Elnor. Or again with his never checking in on his former Starfleet cohort, Raffi, who ended up falling into substance abuse and lost her relationship with her family. Repeatedly, not just with Picard, this series takes big socio-political concepts and makes them felt on a personal level, playing the themes out in a microcosm and a macrocosm. And Patrick Stewart plays all these moments wonderfully, showing a Picard who regrets his actions, yet still wishes to forge forward, to do the right thing, but still needs to learn to humble himself, with scenes like him being yelled at by Starfleet Command, or him giving a speech that ultimately fails to convince because he can't guarantee anything.
I will demand that they end the ban.
And the Federation will listen to me.
sheer fucking
His noble intentions, as good as they are, sometimes aren't enough, and the show repeatedly deconstructs that. We also see a Picard who has aged and doesn't fully fit into the universe as a whole anymore, with him having small moments of tension with Rios where Picard oversteps his bounds as captain, as well as moments where he doesn't understand holographic interfaces, to his shock at seeing the deterioration within the Federation that he has ignored. And this deterioration of the Federation, with its prejudice against synths, and deaths of Starfleet officers like Icheb, and allowance for discrimination on its Romulan settled worlds, led many out there to criticize the tone of this series, thinking it too dark for the typically utopian-focused Star Trek. And this has been a recurring discussion in modern Trek, since Discovery Season 1 showed us a Federation that doesn't always live up to its values. Yet I feel like this is Star Trek doing what Star Trek does best, becoming a reflection of our times. Modern Trek has been less about showing us a utopia and more about how we earn that utopia, showing us moments where our deeply held values are tested and can easily be compromised.
Sometimes in war, the terrible choice is the only choice.
Giving up our values in the name of security is to lose the battle in advance.
And yet shows us how we can still continue fighting for a better tomorrow even if we fail at times.
That we're both working on it, aren't we?
every damn day of my life.
Perhaps this isn't the Star Trek that personally resonates with you, but for me, I think it's using what Star Trek stands for to say something meaningful with it about today. And it's not as if there weren't moments where the Federation failed to live up to its ideals before Star Trek Picard. And Picard was always the man that was there to show Starfleet and the Federation how to do better.
First speech censored, the first thought forbidden, the first freedom denied, chains us all irrevocably.
So it is with this show as well, just played out over a season-long arc instead of resolving in a singular episode. And maybe that's the difference that a lot of people get hung up on, because every episode doesn't end with things feeling perfectly resolved. The show develops its ideas of prejudice against synths through its first episode all the way through the finale, showing us a Federation and a Picard that finally moves beyond it. But we'll talk more about that and the development of the themes in a little bit. But sure, this Trek is a bit more gruesome than previous Treks. But personally, I found the use of language and violence was mostly used with purpose. Icheb's horrific death, for example, highlighted the trauma that we needed to feel that Seven had dealt with. The Admiral using the F word at Picard shocked Picard and us as the audience, forcing us to reconcile that Picard may not be completely right in that moment. Were there times where the violence could have been toned down? Sure.
Shut the fuck up.
But honestly, it rarely bothered me personally. But I also know that it bothers others more than I, and that's a perfectly legitimate criticism. I mean, I certainly do think there is a need for a utopian-only focused Star Trek. CBS, give us our dang Pike series already, dang it! But speaking of things new to Trek, Star Trek Picard showed us a side of the Trek universe that had been mostly unexplored: civilian life. Each main character on the show besides Picard is truly unique to Star Trek, not fitting into the typical Starfleet crew mold. Raffi, played by the wonderful Michelle Hurd, gives us a woman dealing with substance abuse, something that has sadly not been well handled by Star Trek before. Raffi also provides a good foil to Picard, someone willing to challenge him throughout the season, highlighting his hubris and his failures.
Are you out of your goddamn mind?
Elsewhere, Santiago Cabrera gives us an Emmy-worthy performance with his portrayal of Rios and his multiple holograms. I loved the idea of a man who is so shut in and isolated from his emotions that he can only really interact with versions of himself, with the hologram showing elements of his personality that he couldn't show to others. And Rios also holds his own against Picard's gravitas as captain, as well as giving us a man who holds a lot of baggage. Alison Pill's Girardi is also wonderful, giving us an energetic character who seems excited to see her dream of synthetic life, which makes it all the more depressing as she takes one of the show's darkest and most interesting turns. And Issa Briones gives us a wonderful dual performance of Dahj and Soji, realistically portraying both characters' fear, confusion, and need for connection that ultimately gets preyed upon in Soji's case. Even smaller characters like Laris and Javan left a considerable impression despite their limited screen time, and I hope we get more of them in the next season. All of these new characters are well conceived and wonderfully acted, and are often given equal weight as Picard and other beloved returning Trek characters, which shows confidence by the writers to trust in their own creations just as much as the legacy characters that we've known from before, something that Star Trek Discovery initially stumbled with. Yet, despite this, the legacy characters who we did get in this series were also wonderfully explored. Jonathan Del Arco gave us a truly heartwarming portrayal of a man fighting for the basic dignity of a group of people who were very easily overlooked, giving us another one of this show's best ideas: the complete recontextualization of the Borg as Star Trek's greatest villains into Star Trek's greatest victims. And that feels so incredibly true and powerful to the spirit of Star Trek, taking a look at a group of people that had hitherto been vilified and trying to get us to identify with them. I felt so much for the XBs, and that's all thanks to Del Arco. He brought such optimism and grace to this show, even in a storyline focused on marginalization. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that so many responded to the scene where he just gives Picard a hug, highlighting the breath of fresh air that Hugh was.
Hey, everybody needs a hug.
7 of 9 also felt like a natural evolution of the character. I even did a video on 7 and the show's exploration of her trauma as a former Borg. Jeri Ryan consistently dominated all of her scenes, managing to show us a more human 7 who still somehow retains aspects of what we remember of her on Voyager. Ryan spoke to her worries at pulling off that balance, but she does it so ably here. Riker and Troi also featured in one of the series' most beloved episodes. While the stop at Nepenthe was a sidestep for the larger story, it was largely a welcome one. The idea that Riker and Troi had a son who was basically a future J.R.R. Tolkien that died, making his own fantasy fictional worlds and languages, was truly inspired. Some critics took issue with the fact that even the Rikers didn't escape a tragedy. But in over 2 decades, no one escapes a tragedy. Think of any of your friends that you've known for over 2 decades and tell me that they've never experienced anything sad or depressing in those 20 years. For the Riker Trois, it felt real and natural. And while they still felt Thad's death, they weren't defined by it. Instead, having an entirely loving home with their daughter, who was also a true droid, and a great counterpart for Soji's character development at that point in the series. Riker and Troi were also deftly able to challenge Picard in ways that felt both loving and stern, building upon their prior relationship that we had seen in other shows and movies.
This isn't something a ship's counselor is supposed to say, but you had it coming.
Sheer fucking...
It allowed us to feel the nostalgia by making the Riker's home feel like a faux Enterprise D, without it ever beating us over the head or delving into too much fan service. Star Trek Picard, if anything, allowed every plot beat to feel like a natural extension of the Star Trek world that we had already seen, rather than forcing the world to bend around the plot that they had come up with, or some cool fan service moment like putting us back on the Enterprise again. Also, I really want some Riker pizza. Speaking of fan service, Picard showed wonderful restraint in that regard, only ever showing us a cool reference to other series when it felt natural, and it never overplayed the moment. On top of that, the show also helps fix some of the worst aspects of previous Trek incarnations, namely and most importantly, its final send-off of Data in the season finale, building off the complex relationship between Picard and Data, as well as Brent Spiner and Patrick Stewart, and giving us the goodbye that Data deserved but didn't get in Star Trek Nemesis. This scene is almost as good as Spock's death scene in Wrath of Khan, because it feels properly earned and built upon everything that we had seen before. Additionally, I loved how Star Trek Picard challenged some of the previous issues with Star Trek as a franchise, namely that every single person in a species belongs to a single type of culture. All Klingons are angry warriors, all Ferengi are capitalists.
I ken it's true, but I don't ken why.
Here in Picard, not only were we given many aspects of Romulan culture, such as a developed, complex mythology for them rooted in the show's central mystery, but we're also given explanations of different Romulan appearances over the years.
He's a stubborn northerner like you.
As well as different groups with differing beliefs. We also see different aspects of Federation life, such as with the Vegas-like Freecloud. Speaking of Freecloud, while I'm not going to do an episode-by-episode breakdown, go watch my episode reviews for that, I will say that Stardust City Rag is honestly one of my favorite Star Trek episodes ever. I know that that episode isn't on a lot of people's best of list, but I just personally adore it. I loved the actors getting a chance to overact and have fun.
I thought that I looked appropriately sinister.
No comment.
The mini heist plot, and the emotional connection between two characters from previous Trek series who had never met before, as well as the dissection of Seven of Nine's trauma. The episode has issues, as every episode does, but overall, I just personally adored that episode.
I think you're killing it.
Next, it's worth saying that Star Trek Picard looks amazing. It's almost become cliche at this point to say, but modern Star Trek looks great every single time, and Picard is no different. The visual effects are mind-bogglingly good for a TV series. Yet one thing that I personally loved about this specific season was the cinematography. While Star Trek Discovery does have fun playing with inventive camera movements and angles, it often feels unmotivated and distracting. Here on Picard though, each shot feels intentionally conceived and placed, giving us some truly breathtaking images. There are even a few shots throughout the season that symbolically evoked the emotion of the characters, which is always welcome and wonderful. And to wrap out the positives on what I think is the best part of the show, Star Trek Picard does characterization in spades. Or queens, as it were. Every single episode provided at least one, if not multiple scenes that allow characters to just breathe and show us their hidden demons and innermost neuroses. Two of my personal favorites are between Seven of Nine and Picard in episode 5, and Soji and Picard in episode 8.
He loved you.
Even in the most hectic of scenes in this show, there's always small character moments that ring true to a character, both in writing and performance. Like when Picard tries to give an order on the bridge of La Sirena and then realizes that he's overstepped his bounds and that Rio should be the one calling the shots. Or when in the finale, Picard says goodbye to Riker when he thinks he's going to die, and realizes that he just said goodbye to his friend for the last time.
See you around, my friend. Riker out.
Adieu.
You can really feel the hands of novelists Bayer and Chabon, because they know how to give us a glimpse inside a character's internal conflicts, to understand what's going on underneath the surface. Yeah, it's this exact novelist touch that I think is where the show also begins to display its weaknesses, and this brings me to the negatives of the show. While novelists are great at showing internalized conflicts, that often doesn't always translate super well to a visual medium, where internal conflicts often need to be played externally and visually. First and foremost, while I really loved the idea of the synthetics and the mystery behind who Dodge and Soji were, the way the story was unveiled felt clumsy. We are given this rather intricate plot that delves deep into the Romulans' past and why they hate synthetics, and while it's certainly intriguing at first, it ultimately gets tediously drawn out until all the information is unceremoniously dumped on us at the end of the season. And it makes the mystery feel less like a mystery in retrospect and more just lore dumps doled out to us in doses.
Just help me understand what is happening.
It's called Gamma. You know when she blows a blast on the horn, it will unleash all the Chahalagul who've been waiting since the beginning of time.
Breaking a Borg cube. The sheer force of your despair.
This admonition, warning us of the horror and annihilation that came.
You know about 1,000 days of pain. You know, the streets will be slick with entrails of half-devoured corpses.
For hundreds of years since, we have worked in shadow to prevent a second coming.
Oh, hold on. What is Gamadan? What is the story?
We are just told via flashbacks of the message warning of the synths from an ancient civilization and how it changed Romulan culture, rather than the characters unveiling the mystery themselves. What little information the characters do have agency in unraveling is all mostly information that we already knew at that point, and even relies heavily on supposition. Like, for example, why would Raffi presume to know that O is a Romulan agent after the information that she's given? It's a really big leap, and one that she only makes because it's what the writers wanted us and the crew to know at that moment was correct. And many resolutions to the mysteries are often the most obvious answer. Who was behind the synth attack on Mars? Was it perhaps the only villains we've been given this entire season, the Zhat Vash? Yep, of course it was. There's ultimately no intrigue, just further layers of delivered exposition dumps. Speaking of the villains, none of them really fully worked for me. Commodore O being a secret Romulan Vulcan Starfleet double agent is interesting. But she just becomes a stock evil lady doling out orders at the end of the season.
Oh! That's my name, and that is why I chose it.
Narissa is much the same, giving us an impersonation of Cersei Lannister without the nuance. Her relationship with Ramda is shown to us much too late to make us care about either of them, and the only meaningful on-screen relationship that she has is with Narek, and that relationship never evolves. It just stalls at the same story beat over and over again, her just stating repeatedly that she doesn't believe in Narek's plan. There's no sense of tangible and specific backstory between them, or further feelings beyond just animosity. Sure, we could suppose that Narissa is transgender and was the brother that Narek mentions earlier in the season, but that's not made entirely clear, nor is it played by the actors all that well on screen, and it's me reaching for something that's not really felt. Narek himself is made a bit more complex through his manipulation of Soji for his own ends, masterfully playing on her emotions and ultimately betraying her, and thus giving Soji a great arc going forward of not knowing who to trust because she's been so thoroughly mentally abused. It's a gross but realistic discussion of manipulative relationships, but one that I think the show forgives Narek a bit too easily for, since we really don't see him get any comeuppance at the end of the season. There's also something else that I think needs to be briefly touched upon here because I'm a queer person, and that's the LGBTQ themes and characters on this show. This modern era of Star Trek has certainly tried to do better by its queer characters, like with Trek's first gay main characters in Star Trek Discovery. Yet that show ultimately betrayed its LGBTQ audience, killing off the person of color half of its queer couple, relying on the bury your gays and people of color tropes. While season 2 of Disco rectified that mistake, it did leave a bad taste. And Picard sadly did something similar. While Hugh wasn't overtly queer, Jonathan Del Arco is gay and has repeatedly stated that he played Hugh as gay, and based his performance on the death of a former partner with HIV. So to see yet another non-white LGBTQ character named Hugh killed off at the altar of motivating other characters is a bit of a hard pill to swallow. Even if you don't buy into Hugh being gay and aren't really caring about that end of things, Hugh really was the heart of the show at that point in time. And so it's made all the worse that Hugh's death felt like it meant nothing. Sure, Hugh deciding to stand up to the Romulans who had mistreated the XBs felt true to his character, but did his death ultimately change anything? We'd already hated Narissa before this point, so her killing him didn't make us hate her more. I'm sure the intention was for it to motivate Elnor and Seven to lead the XBs to victory. But the fact that both of those characters had little to no screen time with Hugh beforehand blunts the intended emotional catharsis. The only characters that Hugh had an on-screen connection with, Soji and Picard, ultimately have nothing to do with him at that point in the story. So his death feels wasted, which makes it even harder to watch. Moving on, I've spoken about in another video about my issues with 7 of 9 being coded as bisexual, and not being explicitly stated to be such. Her scenes with Bjayzl in episode 5 just felt like a huge tease at the audience, with it saying basically like, hey look, we had a really special relationship, wink wink.
I take it you had no awareness of Annika and my close personal relationship.
Shut up! And I guess the payoff for that is Seven holding hands with Raffi in the finale? Something that didn't feel earned at all because we never got to see Raffi and Seven have any prior relationship before that moment.
The evacuation ended and the neutral zone collapsed. Someone needed to maintain a semblance of order. I suppose at this point it's become habit.
I admire what you do out there with the Rangers.
Again, it's all meant to be interpreted off screen. This isn't good representation. It just comes across as queerbaiting, no matter how well-intentioned I'm sure Shaban and the writers were. Now, hopefully this is a promise that we will get a more well-rounded portrayal of Raffi and Seven's sexuality next season, which I'm really excited for and hopeful for. But ultimately, until then, coupled with the fact of Hugh's death, it all just feels frustratingly inadequate. Next up is an ultimately minor frustration that I've had with Star Trek since Star Trek 2009. And that's how Trek has played fast and loose with grounded science. While ultimately I think modern Trek has rightly focused more on character development and themes of diversity and overcoming prejudice, there's often a lot of convenient space magic at play in these stories. This isn't to say that Star Trek hasn't always over-relied on technobabble to solve problems, but it's often a little less glaring than it is here.
Using red matter, I would create a black hole, which would absorb the exploding star.
Once we caught him, I synthesized the serum from his super blood.
I can modify my dilithium incubator to trigger an ongoing cascade of energy within the crystal by combining it with dark energy. It'll replicate the power of a supernova and charge your crystal.
This endeavor will be rather ridiculous.
The synth do whatever your imagination wants device in the finale is a great example of this.
How?
You have to use your imagination.
My imagination?
This device only exists to set up that Picard can do the crazy holographic Picard maneuver later on in the plot. Why not make that story beat come out of something that we'd already seen before, like La Sirena's holographic emitters? Have Picard take the ship's overly abundant holographic emitters and repurpose them, and use them to make the holographic versions of La Sirena. It's still technobabble space magic, but we'll rely on something that we'd already seen and understand, rather than a clearly forced into the plot magic tool. Otherwise, we as the audience see the writers coming up with that device in the writer's room as we watch the story. And there's a lot of hand-wavy stuff like this. Like, for example, I guess the Borg Q was broken by the power of one woman's grief, a woman who really isn't so much a character as an expositional plot device. So I have no real emotional tether into understanding why her grief was so powerful, outside of it came from a magic space table. Maybe if that had come from a character who I'd come to know and could understand why her grief was so powerful, it might have worked. But it just feels like it happened here because it needed to happen for the plot. Also, modern Trek has an issue with overly dramatic scale and stakes. Why do we need to have 200 Romulan ships and 200 Federation ships in a fleet in the finale? This feels logistically weird to me, given we've seen even the biggest Starfleet battles like the one at Wolf 359 in Star Trek The Next Generation to have way less ships than this. Now, I understand that budgeting of the time played a role in that, but making things physically bigger doesn't always equate to bigger stakes. In fact, it breaks internal logic, as Commodore O basically orders around her 200 ships in unison, instead of having them break off into groups to have different tactics, like getting around the Orchids or going on the other side of the planet. I just feel like the same amount of stakes could have been done with 20 ships, not 200, and would have made much more sense as a result anyways. Also, I honestly kind of tire of every Star Trek show and season ending with a galaxy-ending threat. Discovery Season 1 and 2, as well as Picard, have featured finales where all life in the galaxy, or at least the Federation, was at stake. While this is great to do every once in a while, it's okay to have smaller scale conflicts from time to time. Sometimes, just showing people how to overcome prejudice, or saving a group of people, or a ship, or even just one person is much more relatable.
Why would you do this?
Because the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many.
It works fine here in Picard, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. But if each Star Trek series continually has this level of stakes, it's going to have diminishing returns. The galaxy at stake should feel dramatic, not something that happens every other week.
Nothing would make me happier than you giving me an excuse to kick your treacherous Talsiar ass.
Okay,
Everybody not talking about sex in here. Everybody else, elsewhere.
This also leads me to my biggest problem with the show. And that's how its big ideas don't ever get the time or space to get fully fleshed out. For the most part, every single idea in the show was brilliant. Yet it ultimately felt like so much was left on the table. The XBs and the discussion of Borg victimization was thought-provoking, but ultimately contributed nothing to the overall plot of the season. With the Borg getting jettisoned into space for a quick plot beat, and the Borg cube doing nothing in the finale. Similarly, 7 of 9 becoming a Borg queen feels like a great moment for Seven's struggle to be more human, and her resistance to taking control away from anyone else, especially herself. Yet what did that story beat end up doing in the long run? It may have stopped Narissa, though a small corridor fight like it could have been done without requiring a Borg queen, but it also didn't change 7 of 9 in any real way. She seems to suffer no residual effects from her re-traumatization. And there's so many of these moments throughout the season that are conceptually brilliant, but don't have enough time to truly flourish. Yet, because we take time to see these moments like 7 of 9 becoming the Borg Queen, it detracts from more central elements of the season's core arc. I mentioned Elnor, who I thought was such a brilliant character to bring in to bounce off of Picard. But Picard's father-son relationship with Elnor is explored little outside of episode 4. With no scenes devoted to Elnor forgiving Picard or them rebonding after that episode. So then, when Elnor chooses to leave Picard later, it doesn't ring as emotionally fraught as it could have been if there had been an earned reconciliation. How hard would it have been to watch Elnor leave Picard if they had become like father and son again, with Picard knowing he may never see Elnor again, making Picard feel the pain that Elnor felt when Picard left him as a child. Another great example of this is Raffi's substance abuse, which crops up numerous times throughout the season, with Raffi relapsing into alcohol and drugs. In the finale though, we see her thank Picard for her recovering from substance abuse.
After everything that you've done for me, I need to say thank you.
But when did that actually happen? We saw her get drunk in one episode, Rios put her to bed, and next we know she's cancelled all alcohol at replication, and then she thanks Picard. How did Picard help her? How did she overcome her addiction? And how much did she struggle in that regard? There's no real scenes devoted to it. Similarly, Durrani is quickly forgiven for killing Maddox in favor of focusing on other plots with her character. These are all payoffs to story arcs that have wonderful moments of setup and payoff, but feel like they have several key scenes missing in between. It's all emblematic of this show having too little time to develop its concepts. Either stories don't get enough payoff, or we get a setup and payoff without enough connecting dots from A to Z. Every idea in this show is so unique for a Trek series, but many ultimately don't have the impact that they could have had. And as a result, the season feels awkwardly paced, with the start of the season feeling too slow and the end of the season feeling too fast without much of the necessary middle act. It makes me wish this season had more episodes, or that the writers had taken their 10 amazing ideas and just picked 5 of them to focus on. But in the end, while I wish some of the themes had been more thoroughly explored, when the show does get a chance to properly pay off its ideas, it does so beautifully. The finale's discussion of prejudice and how those who are marginalized often feel the need to radicalize and justifiably retaliate is a truly nuanced concept and idea. And Picard standing up for the synths and showing us how much it means to have an ally stand up for you does what Star Trek always does best. Show us that it's all of our responsibility to believe in one another, to trust one another, in order for us all to move forward. This storyline naturally built off the season-long arc of Soji and Picard's character development, and felt like it fully encapsulated all the ideas that the show wanted to explore with that theme. While the Federation overcoming their synthetic prejudice and lifting the synthetic ban despite the synths literally almost wiping out all organic life felt a little bit hand-wavy. I mean, the political battle in the Federation Council alone to remove the synthetic ban would have taken years, I'm sure. It still paid off the thematic threads of the season. On top of that, add in the great character resolutions like the final scene between Data and Picard, as well as moments between Picard and Soji, it really felt like a truly masterful character arc. It truly felt that when this season was running on all of its cylinders, it was working excellently. So, what do I think ultimately of Star Trek Picard Season 1? I think that ultimately, it's flawed, with so many wonderful ideas not properly developed and major pacing issues. Yet, this season also contains some of the riskiest story choices and most beautiful moments in all of Star Trek. As a result, I think that Star Trek Picard Season 1 is like most of Star Trek's first seasons, filled with potential that builds a wonderful foundation for the series going forward, that I am so incredibly excited to watch grow in the upcoming seasons. That's what Star Trek has always been about, seeing past our flaws to uncover the beauty beneath. And in that way, I think Star Trek Picard Season 1 exemplifies exactly what Star Trek has always been about.
Sheer fucking
That's it for my review of Star Trek Picard Season 1. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you like this season? Did you love it? Did you agree with my critique? Did you disagree with my critique? Let me know. I'd love to read it. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this and also other discussions of Star Trek and pop and geek culture. And if you want to help make these videos even better or want to help me pay the bills, especially during all the crazy stuff going on in the world right now, it would really mean a lot to me if you gave to my Patreon page. Every little bit helps over there and gets you some cool perks as well. But regardless of if you subscribe or give to my Patreon page, I'm just glad that you stopped by, and as always, I hope that you live long and prosper. And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, especially right now: Eli Bergmas, Stefan Schuhart, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Lal Lindley, Marika Kuyechin, Munir Amlani, and Mystic the Monakit.